Welcome to this, my ninth iteration of the church history, um, covering in this case the 8th century, the 700s. Um, I am re-recording this as the first recording fell through, so there'll be a lack of audience participation in this one here. Um, Peter Middleton made a couple of comments. I may mention what he said because it was fairly good. At any rate, the major trends of the 700s are going to be the spread of Islam. We saw the birth of Islam in the late 600s and spreading out. This will become a new empire as it spreads out and dominates a vast area of Europe and Asia, and almost sort of renaissance that happens in this area with Islam. Next one is the birth of Christendom. Europe, the Roman administration having really much failed and gone away, a new system of 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 relationship is building up among the kings of Europe. Uh, we touch very quickly on the Vikings, that they're much more involved in the next century or so, but they do come in, and their first forays are in this century. We'll cover that briefly. And then the dynastic struggles among the kings of Europe. As they say, if there was ever a dark spot of the Dark Ages, it really was the dynastic struggles, which is not really fair, but we'll go into that a little bit. The spread of Islam. Islam was born in the 600s, but its spread was prodigious, and throughout the following century, the world saw Islam take all of northern Africa and Spain. It also goes way into Asia. The territory was already weak due to the failing and ailing Roman administration, so Islam was able to take the territory quickly and with little resistance. Islam was able to take the lands of the Eastern Roman Empire with very little trouble and settle them. Here is an image of how far the Islamic spread of Islam went in this sort of Islamic empire or the caliphate. Obviously, it's not that there are individual areas run by individual caliphs, but the social and linguistic cohesion was tremendous. These areas were not necessarily originally organized, especially from into Persia and into Asia. Obviously, the Roman Empire had been very organized, but that had fallen apart. Again, the administration was failing, and then the arrival of the Germanic, Vandals and Visigoths did nothing to stabilize it. So by the mid to late 700s and going into this, you can see how much territory the Islamic world was able to occupy. One of the key things about the Islamic world was cultural cohesion. And this was primarily done for their adopting of a lot of Greek influences. The Muslims were basically desert dwellers and didn't have a lot of their own architectural history or what have you. But as they encountered this Greek world, and India as well, they're going to adopt it and really make it their own and create their own flavor to it, so that the Islamic world really will gain a extremely strong cultural cohesion. As Peter Middleton mentioned last time, that Islam really is almost more of a cultural movement even than a religious one, adopting its religion basically from a form of Judaism and its culture from the Greek and Indian influences. Based on Greek and Oriental designs, Islamic architecture gained a specific flavor and marked the civilization which would grow up around it. This is from India, but you can see how clearly Islamic it looks. You see this, and right away, it has a flavor, it has a style that is pronouncedly Islamic. Interesting enough, for the picture on the lower right there, if you look on the walls there, you can actually see a swastika. It's the Indian style, so it's backwards from what the Nazis would use sometime later. But again, it represents peace. But anyway, you can see that even there on the temple, the Arabic writing above it and such. But again, you can see the flavor, and it is definitely has a certain feel to it or certain style to it. Commerce and culture. The arrival of Islam, especially in North Africa, brought a sort of renaissance of education and commerce. Roman educational and commercial structures were in serious decay, and the arriving or invading armies of Goths and Vandals and others did nothing to stabilize things. Islam, because it was centrally run and very culturally cohesive, brought a certain prosperity to the areas it conquered. These are images from the time of Islam, sometimes even around in Baghdad, but also down into the what used to be the Greek Empire and North Africa. And you can see here that commerce and trade flourished. You saw how big, how large of a territory were under the control of Islam. Products, goods, and even services from as far away as India uh, and up as in Baghdad would make their way down through what used to be the Byzantine Empire, down into North Africa, and up even into Spain. So the ability of the commerce and trade was just tremendous and hadn't been sent out in quite some time. On the right hand, you can see here storage of goods as well as architecture, a lot of building, a lot of developing of economic with trade and things like that. Standard of coinage. One of the things, now, the Byzantine Empire had its own coinage and it certainly had some measure. However, there had been problems with it. Even the term Byzantine refers to complication and such. Trade was not necessarily very strong, and then again, the arrival of these invading or arriving armies. Oftentimes, kings would have their own coinage, or they would debase the currency, or elevate it, or have their own currency. So it was not standardized. The Muslim coinage and the Muslim trades was very standardized and allowed prices to be regulated, and again, really increased the ability of trade and encouraged it. The introduction of commercial mathematics. This is incredibly important for history. The trade was done with money, and weights and measures were enforced. The weight of the coinage and how much it was worth was very enforced, and weights were very carefully measured. And the introduction of the abacus, which is an Islamic form of computing. It's done with beads, and you're counting. Now, this is an historic abacus. I couldn't find a picture of a base 10 historic one. This is a base 6 with the 2 on top. Not all mathematics is base 10. For example, our time structure is base 12, 12 hours, 24 hours in a day. Our week is 7 days in a week, 3 days a month. So not all mathematics is base 10, but our money is base 10. But anyway, here you see an ancient form of abacus. Here is a base 10 abacus. Now, let's go through for a second how it works. The lower level is going to be your 1 column. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10. Once you have 10, you push 1 from the next column, the tens column, right above it over, and everything goes back. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10. You push a second one from the tens column, the green column, all the blue, all the ones go back, and this continues. So 10, 30, and once you get to the end of the green column, the tens column is all at the end. You push 100 over, the yellow, the middle column, and everything else goes back, and you begin all over again. And again, once you have all the greens over, you push a third yellow over. So you have your ones, your tens, your hundreds. Above that is your thousands. Above that is your 10,000s. And so you're able to count up here like this. So looking at this here, with the 10,000s, thousands, hundreds, tens, and ones, we have 34,523. You see how to do that, all right? Each of them representing a column. And this became a means in the Islamic world of counting and basically trade in general. This is what led to the Arabic numerals. This is how they differed from Roman. You can see Arabic numerals are based on columns. There's the ones column. When you hit 9, you now have 1 in the tens column and 0 in the ones column. All right, 10s going up to 100. 100, you have 1 in the hundreds column, nothing in the tens, and nothing in the ones, and then it begins to count over. So this is based, the same as with abacus, the way Arabic numerals work. And they differed from Romans, which obviously have their own little addition right in built into them. Now, don't kid yourself. Roman numerals were very useful and very competent. The Romans built the aqueducts. The Romans built the Colosseums. Roman numerals work, but the way you add them is different. It is not nearly as simple and straightforward. I don't know how to do it, but I have seen it done. But the way you add and subtract Roman numerals is kind of similar to how you multiply and divide fractions. if you have two fractions side by side, you're able to dividing them. You begin by canceling out on the top and the bottom the numbers that are the same because they would have worked their way out in the equation, and you're fighting it down to your main equation, and there's your answer. But the sense of canceling out, the same thing is true with adding and subtracting. Especially subtracting, is you're going to cancel out, the numbers of which you have duplicates and get down to your main equation. But with Arabic numerals, you're basically lining up in a column. It's faster and easier to add and subtract Arabic numerals in Romans. You've also the introduction of algebra and the introduction of the zero. The Romans didn't have a zero, but again, you can see here, going back for a second, once you have one in the tens column, you have nothing in the ones column, and they had the zero indicating no quantity. All right. Also, the idea of introducing an x or an unknown quantity and learning how to figure out for x was brought in. It's actually a book, and the title is longer, but algebra is in the title, but it was adopted by the West to explain this. But this kind of mathematics, and again, it's really comes again, the Greeks and the Arabs and that kind of thing. It was brought in more than it was invented, but it was spread through by the arrival of Islam, and a lot of this stuff came in and really the West hadn't really seen it in quite some time. Geography and geometry. Again, much of this again was from Greek and scholars in Sumeria and such, or whatever that area of Baghdad is called. I can't think of it right now. The result was translated into Arabic, and it spread through, and it became people were able to get their hands on these things, who hadn't seen them in quite some time. Again, this kind of cultural cohesion, educational cohesion. Literacy with literature and philosophy. Reintroducing works of Plato, even Aristotle to a point, in Arabic through the areas where the Muslims would think, even to a point theology, although Islam is not very strong for theology, but stronger for philosophy. And again, literature, I'm mostly speaking of philosophical works. You didn't have works of fiction necessarily, but if you had a resurgence of interest in thinking and in reading and such with the Arabic world, it's kind of sad because we think of the Arabic world today and the jihad, people running around with ISIS and being violent. And there certainly was violence, don't get me wrong. It was mostly a matter of conversion. But once it stabilized, remember when the Crusaders went out and encountered the Muslim world, and even as far as Baghdad, they were shocked by the level of civilization and culture. Europe was nowhere close to what Islam was when the Crusaders got over there in the early Middle Ages. There really was. There was a certain sophistication that had been achieved. Now, while it is completely unfair to say there was no philosophy in North Africa or eastern part of Europe when Islam arrived, it is, however, correct to say that the schools in North Africa and Europe were generally not for the common man, but rather those who needed an education: doctors, lawyers, the clergy, things like that. Many of the ancient schools had fallen into disuse or were just shut down. The church ran schools, but these offered mostly basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic for the masses. The average man and woman on the street did not have any serious exposure to literature or philosophy. Islam, because of its focus on leisure and the importance of reading, the Quran, stimulated literacy and interest in philosophy. That's actually kind of where we are today, really. I mean, how many people on your street today have had any serious exposure to Plato or Aristotle and could tell you how does Plato define the good life, or what are Aristotle's categories, for any of the breakdown of how matter and how the world works? They haven't, So we kind of understand how this was. It became very pragmatic. In America, it's more a matter of getting a job and being productive. In the kind of late early medieval time here we're talking about, or Dark Ages, people were mostly working in the fields and such, and there were craftsmen, but you didn't have a lot of use for, again, the philosophy and such on the street at this point in time. Medicine, apothecary, and anatomy. Again, a lot of this was Greek books, and again from out in Syria and that kind of thing. These works made their way down into North Africa and into Spain. It's actually a fact that when the Black Plague came through Europe, Spain never suffered the Black Plague the way the rest of Europe did, because the Muslims had a very intricate way of moving water around and washing things and keeping clean, and that cleanliness actually kept Spain from falling into the Black Plague. Much of it comes from this period of the development of this Muslim culture in Spain and elsewhere. The Battle of Tours. Islam seemed unstoppable. The wave of conquest was a veritable juggernaut, which swept through North Africa, into Spain, and then into France. Nothing seemed to be able to stop it. The armies of Europe were no longer organized like they were under Rome. The new armies under various kingdoms of early Europe were heavily armored and mostly disorganized. They were used to fighting each other rather than an objective foe. Finally, however, at Tours in southern France, one king was able to halt the Islamic tide, Charles Martel. Martel means the hammer. We're not sure that was actually his real name or was his nickname, but there you go. This is what France looked like in 700. Collection of duchies which were not united or organized. Aquitaine, Burgundy, Austrasia, Neustria. These are early. They actually break down a bit more. And then Provence in the corner down there. They're going to organize more as the centuries go along here. Actually, Gascony down in the left corner. But you can see how disorganized it was. And these duchies, some of them hardly even spoke the same language, or they would speak some form of French, or very, very early French, or some form of Latin. Again, you even had the Doc and Dui, as you'll see later on in the Middle Ages, but this is still a very disorganized collection of duchies. The Battle of Tours happened in the lower corner, the southwestern corner of France, and into Vasconia, you see, which is Vasconia, the area of the cows. Vache is in French and vaca in Spanish. And you heard the Basque countries, the Pays Basque, or the area of the Basque, with the originally the B, was the area of the cows. So that's kind of in between France and Spain. And you can see this all over the place here, the kind of various skirmishes that happened as they tried to get Islam and push them out of France, again down into Spain. Here's some pictures of the fighting, and I realize these are pictures probably mostly from, they're French, but they're supposed to be against Islam, but obviously the year is questionable here. But the fighting was quite vicious, and there were some atrocities on both sides. And here, now this is going the wrong way, because it's the French. The French should be pointing the spears, not the other side. But the only one I could find here. This is kind of how the French were able to push back against Islam, was by adopting an old Roman technique of the phalanx. The use of long spears and shields played a key role in the victory of Tours. The Islamic forces were quicker and more organized, but the forces under Charles Martel were able to form long battle lines with long spears, and the Muslim forces were unable to penetrate it and were forced to retreat. Europe was almost literally saved becoming an Islamic state by one battle. How close they got, and how decided the Battle of Tours was. What it was the Islamic were much faster, they had very light armor, and they were able to strike and run, almost kind of the blitzkrieg like we'd see many centuries later. What Charles Martel was able to do was line up horses with these very, very long spears. I think something like, it was 30 feet, it's probably too far, but very, very long spears, and march forward. And they couldn't get past it. If they got past the spears, then they had to deal with the swords and the shields and the swords. But they were able to hold them off with these long phalanxes of long spears, and literally just push them back out of Spain, or out of France and into Spain. Meanwhile, in Europe, the rise of Christendom. Back in Europe, something new was happening. Christian kings were establishing Christian kingdoms, and a new political and social system was developing: feudalism. Under the Roman system, there were paid professional soldiers. However, the new kings were not able to maintain professional armies like the Romans did. Instead, they earned the loyalty of a man and made him a bond of faithfulness with him. Fides in Latin is faith, and fidel means faithful. In French, it's faith is fe, it later becomes foi. Spanish is fe, Italian is fe, and English is faith. So fidel, faithful, becomes feudal or faithful, which becomes feudal. So feudalism means faithfulism. Oaths were made to a lord by his vassal to be faithful in his service. The oath was sworn by placing one's hand inside the lord's, and the pledge solemnized by touching the man with a sword on his shoulders. You held up your hand as if you would in church. They call folding your hands or placing the palms together, and you present them to your Lord, and he would put his hands in a similar position over the top of yours, and you'd make your pledge. That hand that and Peter Middleton mentioned this when we were live, that this question of where did this come from, and the folding of your hands. So originally, lifting your hands up, holding your hands up, was the symbol of prayer in the Old Testament. The Jews would lift their hands up to God, and this began with early Christians, but that's hard to do for any length of time. So the hands would drop down to your side, as you see many priests when they offer Mass or the Eucharist or even Divine Liturgy will have their hands kind of down but at shoulder's length with their hands out like this, was for prayer. Well, the vestments, and this is still true in Orthodoxy, it used to be very much true in the Western Church as well, though it's kind of fallen away, is that the vestments were bulky. The ancient chasuble was quite literally a circle, first of wool and then of silk. And if you put your hands down, it would fall longer than your hands were. So if you weren't doing something, you'd put your hands together. You'd push the palms together in the center of your chest. It would make sure the vestments didn't fall to the ground or anything. And it became the default position of hands if you weren't doing something with them. So if you're using your hand, it's one thing. If you're not using them, you place the palms together kind of on the solar plex, center of the chest, and this became the symbol of the resting. This was adopted by these kings to make the pledge of faithfulness. Sometimes promotions were even made in the field of battle. As the war times were here and people would distinguish themselves in battle, young men could be actually given promotions right there and made lords, nobles right there on the battlefield, although usually it was a much more involved ceremony. Becoming a knight. A young man who wanted to be a knight would begin around age 10. He would become the page of a knight and serve him. He would take care of his horse, clean his armor, and serve in a number of other capacities, even assisting him in battle once he was older. Usually a matter of after they would do a horse charge and he'd come back, because again, oftentimes the melee combat was relatively rare. They didn't really want to be in melee combat. They wanted to be on their horse and charging and attacking. And they'd come back after a wave and he might get a fresh spear or change out his shield if it had been damaged, and the page would be there, take it, clean up, give him a new one, and send him back out in battle. When he was ready, he would be knighted by his lord. This was an elaborate ceremony requiring an all-night vigil and fasting. The next day, the young knight-to-be attended Mass, at the end of which he would make his pledge and receive his knighthood. Sometimes even once you had received a field promotion, they would still have you go through this, because it had a great deal of religious and the idea of faithfulness, a great deal of significance behind this. This is a very romantic idea of this by pre-Raphaelites. Usually it was the king that did it, but here's an example of the dubbing, where they would place the sword on the left shoulder and then the right shoulder and create the man a knight. Pages were servants to the Lord. I love these here. The upper right corner, serving table was very common, serving in any number of servile areas. It taught them the service as well. As they grew older, other young men would serve them. And by having them serve, they knew how hard it was, and they knew it was involved. So they were less likely to be, autocrats or what have you, because they had served as well. They knew what it was like to carry the platter. They knew what it was like to do the dishes. They knew what it was like to do the work. So to give them a sense of compassion. Right below that, you see all the different kind of wear the young men would dress, and early forms of knight would wear some of the symbols early on as they got farther along of knighthood in their service. And the lower left corner, I love this, with a young boy carrying the academic's gown. And this is very, very true. There was any number of young men who wanted to become in the service of the church or in the service of a noble would do these ceremonial things, which really added to the kind of the glory and pomp in some senses of just everyday life, and really brought everyday life a certain religious and ceremonial context. Thus, we come to kind of the hierarchy that is beginning to coalesce in the early Middle Ages. At the very height, we have the king. Below that, we have the lords, vassals to the king. Below that, we have the knights, who are vassals to the lord. And behold that, we have the peasants and serfs. A good example of this, for example, is the Lord of the Rings. Minas Tirith is the city of the king. But then you have Rohan, and Rohan has a king. But the king still is bound under Minas Tirith. So really, Rohan's king is more of a duke. And then you have other dukes among the elves and such like that, among the dwarves. But it's a good example of Rohan, which has its own culture and its own charism. Still, Minas Tirith is, what is it? It's Gondor. Gondor calls for aid, and Rohan will answer. And then what happens in the Rohirrim? He walks the soldier walks out and says, men of Rohan, the oaths you have made, now is the time to fulfill them. Very middle age attitude up there. These men were not necessarily paid, or they were usually given tracts of land. And again, the king would give a large tract of land to a lord, who would then give smaller tracts of land to his vassals, who would finally give them to the peasants. So everybody was served someone above them. And the king obviously was the lord overall, but also was servant. Each of them had obligations to the ones beneath them, usually protection, and then the people above you would pay rent or would pay military service. And this begins to really coalesce here. Again, possibly before, but 700s and on, you really see this coalescing. King Arthur. We're not exactly sure when or if really King Arthur lived. He quite possibly did. He could be as early as the 400s and could be as late as the 7 or 8. I'm picking 700 here because one of the things King Arthur does, the mythos of King Arthur, really coalesces around this time in a couple of different ways. The Arthurian ideal was a contrast between the Christian knight ideal, which was developing, and the equality between knight and lord, which was disappearing, added with the Grail, which is a powerful Christian image of Britain. There are 3 elements of King Arthur that fit into this. The first is the almost baptism of the pagan world, the lady in the lake with the sword coming out. You have, what's the island they have? I can't think of it right now. Anyway, there's this island with all the ladies that are there, and these are almost like pagan Celtic images, which are being baptized and used for the sake of the search for the Holy Grail, the knights and their purity and their individual struggles. So you can see the end of the pagan world and kind of baptism of many of these pagan. Avalon, that was the name of the island. Avalon, and I'm not a real scholar or that of all of this. I don't know it all that well, but I remember there's any number of these things which almost could be seen as pagan, which are very much used serving a Christian context. And again, the quest for the Holy Grail, which goes back to Joseph of Arimathea, who was said to have first brought Christianity to Britain. So you can see these Christian images. And again, the round table where all the knights are equal at the table really has an ideal. You can see the end of some of the Roman thinking, and yet it's still a medieval feel to it with the king and each of his knights. So the Arthurian legend really coalesces much around this time. The Vikings. I will cover this much extensively in the next century and so, but they first make their appearance in Europe, and so it's important to touch on them for a second. The Vikings are a unique peoples, and from the north, the Scandinavians came down, and as if Europe didn't have enough problems with Islam in the south, toward the end of the 20th century, the Vikings began making incursions in the north. Scandinavian warriors came out of the north in the beginning in the 700s. Their society did not allow much upward mobility, and legends of the wealth of Christian lands led many northerners to venture down to England, Scotland, and France in search of treasure. I'll cover them more in the next century, as I said, but I want to introduce them as the first Viking incursions begin in the 700s. One of the things about, I think I have a slide for this, but I'll start with it here, that distinguished or made the Vikings very much different from the Europeans' armies and really scared them was the Vikings were not necessarily very well organized. The Viking armies were sometimes rather chaotic and really were on individual ferocity, individual bravery, much so than any kind of organized battle structure. This is an example of it here, berserkers, which comes from Scandinavian/German bearshirt. And the warriors would literally clothe themselves with animals and take on even some of their characteristics in battle and in fighting and such. The Vikings did not fight with much organization, with ferocity. They prized dying in battle, which made them very brave. This really was the big thing, was an individual warrior would show up there, Viking warrior, would confront even more than one knight. He'd walk up there, scream, and charge at them with no fear in his eyes. And he would attack them. It was personal ferocity which gave him his strength. And they would fight with, and there was even talk of using various drugs, and they talk about woad, although that's more Celtic than Scandinavian. But really, it was the idea of this personal ferocity. It was the psychological scaring and terrifying the enemy that gave him his strength in battle, much more so than any kind of organization. There was also the idea that they prized dying, the idea of going to Valhalla. Their life was rough already, didn't have a lot of creature comforts to it, and their whole culture was around dying in battle and going to Valhalla. And so the individual Viking was not afraid of death. And there's an excellent series about it that came out a number of years ago, and there's several seasons of it, which does a fairly good job. But death was, you couldn't make it to Valhalla, their heaven, without being a brave warrior and probably dying in battle. And you had the Valkyrie who would come down and carry the warrior up to dine with his fathers in Valhalla. And this was very strong, and it made them just extraordinarily brave and fierce when they fought. And this was something the Europeans hadn't dealt with before. More on this to come in the next century. Dynasties. One of the difficulties of this age was the founding of dynasties. Kings wanted to protect their lands and squires, but also secure their heritage and name. Good kings sometimes ended up doing bad things to establish their dynasties. The thing about this is that Europe, as we saw in France, and it's very much the same thing in England, is fractured. Large duchies, it's disorganized, and that leads to, you saw the problem they have overcoming is Islam. Now, the same problem with the Vikings is that each individual king only has the men loyal to him, and as a man gets older and is loyal to someone, he might decide at some point in time that he's as good, if not better, and not be loyal, and decide to create his own legacy. And so you have this social chaos, which is usually what they refer to as the Dark Ages. That's the dark aspect of it, is the social chaos of these individual kingdoms trying to coalesce into nation states or into larger organized masses here. In England, King Ethelred ruthlessly sought to unite England under his reign. He battled other kings and made dynastic marriages to accomplish his purpose. Sometimes these kings were very devout Christians. At the same time, you look at what they do and you kind of scratch your head. It really is one of the difficult aspects of history, is that as they tried to coalesce the kingdom, there were all kinds of ruminations and such going on. In France, the Carolingians made plan to usurp the Merovingians, who had become weak rulers, especially after Charles Martel, who was a Carolingian's victory over the Muslims. We'll actually see it with Charlemagne in the next one here. Charlemagne founds the Carolingian dynasty, but Charlemagne was not originally the king. I don't remember the name of their exact term, and I'll have it for the next one, but they were the servants of the kings, the Merovingians, and they finally usurped them. But anyway, you can see these dynasties trying to coalesce and such. If there was ever any truth to the term Dark Ages, it was here. Kings fought each other for control and consolidation of territories. Sons betrayed fathers. Wives betrayed husbands as families fought to consolidate territory with their family in charge. This would continue for centuries, but it is a dark spot in the history of Christian Europe. Even as late as 1100, you see some of this still going on. This trying to consolidate European countries into what they would become. And now, preview of the next century, the 800s, we will go into the Vikings. This is really when they come in, and we're going to go through their incursions and where they establish and how they would grow and become a part of Europe, Christianize and become a part of Europe. We're going to cover Charlemagne and the creation of the Holy Roman Empire. Really, this is such a key thing, not since the 300s has such a monumentous event changed and affected Europe. And the further evangelization, I was going to cover it this century in the 700s, but really we're a little bit too early. There's still some coalescing going on. And you do have small evangelistic efforts to areas up and towards Scandinavia or out again in the east toward Russia, but they were much smaller and often suppressed very quickly. You finally have someone or some group that finally has the right mix of cultural cohesion, or they speak the right language or the right approach, and finally Christianity can take root in these countries, and you begin to have their Christianization. As I say, I'm all by myself here recording this for the most part, the wife, and so I do you have any questions? No. So I can't ask questions I had before. John Shields asked one and I don't remember what it was, so I'm going to have to pass on that. But anyway, here we have the eighth century, and we'll see you next time for the 9th.